Hello everyone, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum here in Morristown, Tennessee, and we'd like to welcome you to today's episode in which we will be discussing the history of our porcine pals here in America and how they helped to transform the modern American landscape as we know it today. But before we do, did you know that the famous Wall Street in Manhattan was originally named after a stone border which was erected to keep hogs out of certain areas of the colony? Or did you know that by the 20th century, hogs and their fats had more or less fallen out of favor, being replaced by various petrochemical industries, which were providing certain industrial oils to lubricate machinery and other such things. And it's because of this that, as we see time progress, hogs and their byproducts grew less and less valuable, save really only for the meat. And because of this, it is easy to forget that there was once a time when hogs were deemed a necessity for surviving life on the harsh frontier of early America. Yet, also as time has progressed, we see that yet again we see a rise in the feral hog population, which has caused some concern, particularly in the southern states, as to the destruction of property and crops, and therefore it has become more necessary than ever to figure out a way to regulate and control these populations, something that our ancestors, interestingly enough, had to deal with. So, with that being said, how in the world did our forefathers and mothers figure out ways to regulate and control these hog populations? Well, first and foremost, we have to start at the beginning, where they were introduced. You see, when Christopher Columbus sailed to exploit the riches of the New World, he brought a few pairs of breeding hogs with him on one of his ships. Now, the purpose of this was to provide meat in order to stave off hunger in the event that they were lost or blown off course. But the primary reason was that once they had arrived in the New World and had established a settlement of sorts, they would be able to begin breeding the pairs on site. Well, this didn't take off too well, but we see that 100 years later, when Hernando de Soto and his Spaniards had come to the New World, they brought 7 breeding pairs with them to go ahead and increase pork production. And it was really there with de Soto's pigs that the pork industry in the Americas, as we know it today, really took off. Because within just a few years' time, the population of hogs in America had went from those 7 breeding pairs and had ballooned to over 700. But now, with this came a few challenges. One of the first is, well, you have to control them, otherwise they'll get into your gardens, they'll root up everything, and yes, you can still eat the pigs, but the human body does need some fruits and vegetables from time to time. And so there was that issue in and of itself. Also, some of the hogs would escape from their pens, and they would wander off into the swamps and the woods and eventually make their way up to the mountains to give us this precursor to the feral hog problem that we have today. Now, of course, as the New World became more and more settled, we see that farmers, they go out and they would not only have their own breeding pairs of hogs, but they would also go ahead into the mountains or wherever these feral hogs would be found to hunt them in order to provide meat for the winter. Now, there's a very famous feud here in American history, which I'm sure most of you have heard about, and it is the Hatfield and McCoy feud. And one of the reasons that it's stated that the feud possibly started was over the killing of a pig. Now, with our modern lenses, we think that kind of a silly affair to fight over, but you don't realize just how important a singular hog, or multiple hogs could be, to make sure that your family lasted throughout the winter. For example, a proper shote, fattened up and raised to the point of where it was going to be butchered, could provide you not only with skin, which could be tanned and turned into a strong, resilient leather. You also had animal fats, which were used to lubricate machinery, wagon wheels, protect your farming implements, or your rifles and knives and tomahawks from rust. You could also use it to oil your animal skin clothing, which makes them water resistant. To say nothing of the fact of the matter, it could be used to make medicines, soaps, as well as, in a pinch, used for lighting your homes. Now, of course, we also know about the delicious animal byproducts that comes from a hog, and people, they had to have that in order to survive. The things we take for granted today, such as ham, salted pork, bacon, chitlins, so on and so forth, well, these were some of the main food staples that could be found here on the frontier. And just with the small glimpse of the products that I told you you could get off of one animal, to say nothing of if you butchered a couple more, well, you were going to be pretty well set. And needless to say, if you kind of understand where I'm coming from now, then you'll understand how the Hatfield and McCoy feud, if it truly did start over a hog. Of course, there was a couple different factors in there, but that's another story. But if one of the starting reasons for that was the killing of a hog, well, then you kind of understand that is something worth fighting over at that time. But regardless, we see that even before the famous Hatfield and McCoy feud, that people started to grow hogs in droves. And it wasn't quite the industrial level that we see today, but we have evidence to show that frontier families alone were growing and processing hogs at a pretty rapid rate and in quite substantial numbers. This is evidenced by an excerpt from a letter written in the Knoxville Gazette from 1796, in which it states that the average family would keep anywhere between 20 to 50 hogs on site. But now, needless to say, once the hogs were full grown from shotes, which are the baby pigs, to adults, well, the time inevitably came for them to be butchered. Interestingly enough, there was a very old common practice that has only come into extinction within the last few decades, and that was the pig picking time. Whenever the first permanent frost come through and it got good and cold, well, neighbors from miles around would come to help each other out, and they would come to one particular setup. It could be old Farmer Brown's place, and they would go ahead and get together in order to butcher not only his hogs, but also their hogs as well. And so, like it takes a village to raise a child, it took a village to process hogs. And once the hog had been dispatched, well, they would typically hang it up in the barn to let it dry and cool off. And once that was done, the meat would cut a lot more easily, and you would be able to separate the fat from the meat, the skin from the meat, so on and so forth. So you didn't really get a lot of excess waste or scrap. Now, of course, because of this, the butchering of the hog or the dispatching of the hog did not take place in the same area as the processing did. So they had various stations in which they would work out, and each table or each station would be required to process something different. One table it could be meat, one table it could be ears, one could be skin, one could be rendering down the fat and separating the rendered fat from the chitlins, or cracklins as we like to call them today, which cracklins with a good bottle of Blenheim ginger ale, by God, that's one of the best snacks you can get a hold of. But I digress. Nonetheless, we see that as time does progress, it becomes increasingly harder for the average farmer to make a profit off of raising these hogs, and so they turn to selling them to these industrial processing places. They also become to realize that it was a lot cheaper and they could stand to make a better profit if they only raised the shotes to a certain age and then shipped them off to these industrialized centers, such as in the Iowa Corn Belt, where they could be finished on crop rations and not scraps. Now, the whole reason behind this was, yes, obviously you don't have as much work, you can stand to make a pretty good profit, but where the true profit margin lies in its increase, is the fact of the matter that the animals finished on crop rations as opposed to scraps and foraging, well, they ended up creating less fat or tallow, which by this time in American history was not quite as widely prized as it had been, because by this point, around the late early 1900s, animal fats were being replaced by various industrial type oils. And so the hogs were really only worth their meat and their hides anymore, so they were able to breed out leaner hogs. And this is where your profit margin lies. So it was because of this that the hogs were being shipped in railroad cars and to different cities where they could be fed and then processed, or even sent to other places for further processing, that we see such travel hubs such as Chicago and Kansas City not only being firmly established, but also beginning to thrive into the big cities that we knew them as, until you get into today's times. And, well, if I had the Batmobile, I wouldn't even drive through Chicago unless you paid me for it. But I digress. But what we do see is that at this point, the days of the yeoman farmer here in the backwoods of Tennessee or other such states, raising their own hogs on their farm, or going and hunting feral hogs, capturing some and breeding and raising them in captivity, or just fattening them up to dispatch them and have them at a later date, those were rapidly coming to an end. And by the mid to late 20th century, we see that the times of the pig pickings and getting together to process your pigs was about near over. And today, it's pretty much non-existent. But folks, although the time of the pig has come to an end, well, it's left quite a lasting legacy. And I think it's one that does need to be remembered, because if it hadn't been for our fine swine friends, well, we probably wouldn't be here as well as we are today. But although that brought about the end of the pig picking and the pig raising on farms, this also, of course, brings about the end of today's video. And I hope that you have thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope you learned a little something new about our four-legged friends. And hopefully you didn't get too hungry when I started mentioning all those fine pork products. I know I'm actually kind of wanting to go home and cook up a mess of bacon right now, but that's just me. Nonetheless, as I said, this does conclude today's episode, and we thoroughly hope you've enjoyed it. If you're not already subscribed, please feel free to subscribe to our channel, as well as to like, share, and also click the bell icon so you'll never miss an upload. I do also want to apologize. We had some technological issues last night, but hey, we've got it taken care of, and we're back on track. Now, of course, with that being said, I'd always like to invite you to continue to follow along on Facebook and YouTube. Support is greatly appreciated. But also, I'd like to invite you to join us for next week's video, where we're going to take a drastic turn when it comes to talking about certain foods and how important they were in the 18th and 19th century. But I've done taken enough time out of your day, and I think it's only fitting to go ahead and get out of your hair. So until next week, this is Isaac White signing off from the Crockett Tavern Museum, saying goodbye and God bless.